To secure his bid for the consulship, Caesar approached Pompey and Crassus. He put to them a proposition: lend him their absolute support in his campaign. And he, once in office, would see to it that their own considerable political ambitions were fully realized. In his heart of hearts, Caesar knew that Crassus was a sure thing. He owed the man a prodigious sum of money, and in the grand theater of debt, it is the borrower, not the lender, who often commands the stage. For a man as famously avaricious as Crassus, allowing his debtor to fail would be to write off the entire investment, a catastrophic loss. Pompey, however, remained a variable of considerable uncertainty. And so, for the sake of insurance, our man Caesar arranged for his 14-year-old daughter to be wed to Pompey, a gentleman then in his 50s. Caesar himself was 40. One moment he was of an age to call Pompey uncle, the next, through this dizzying realignment of domestic affairs, he was the man's father-in-law. When one further considers that Caesar had also, at one point, enjoyed the intimate company of Pompey's wife, the relational dynamics of the entire affair descend into a rather squalid farce. Pompey, for his part, contemplated this tangled web of connections and concluded that the arrangement was not, on balance, to his disadvantage. He agreed. Thus was the alliance of Caesar. Pompey and Crassus forged. History would come to know it as the First Triumvirate. The following year, 59 years before the birth of Christ, with the backing of his two powerful allies, Caesar duly became consul of Rome. According to the historian Suetonius, in his Lives of the 12 Caesars, the arrogance of these three men was a thing to behold. They boasted, and quite openly, that no measure could be passed in the state that went against the will of any one of them during a session of the Senate. Caesar gave a practical demonstration of this new reality. He had his co-consul, a man named Bibulus, unceremoniously ejected from the chamber. This was not merely a political maneuver. It was a flagrant act of contempt, a slap in the face to the very foundations of the Roman Republic, and the result, the assembled senators, every last one of them, held their peace, a telling silence. Now, Rome possessed a peculiar tradition for marking the passage of time. Each year was designated not by a number, but by the names of its two serving consuls. The year 59 BC should, by all rights, have been known as the year of the consulship of Bibulus and Caesar. But the people of Rome, feeling a certain helpless frustration at Caesar's flagrant power play, resorted to a dark and subtle humor. They began to call it the year of the consulship of Julius and Caesar. Julius, you see, was Caesar's clan name. The joke, therefore, was that great Rome had but one consul that year, and his name was Caesar. This is, perhaps, a fine moment for a brief, yet necessary, digression into the labyrinthine world of Roman nomenclature. Caesar's full name was Gaius Julius Caesar. Gaius was his personal name. Julius was the name of his clan, what we might loosely call a surname, but Roman clan names had a peculiar feature. They differed for men and women. Julius, ending Aeneas, was masculine. The feminine form ended in Ia, Julia. The result was that a brother and sister from the same clan would appear to have two different surnames. This feminine suffix, Ia, was later adopted as a common ending for place names, signifying the land of a certain people. Romania, the land of the Romans. Bulgaria, Serbia, and so on, all owe their names to this Latin convention, a bit like adding land or shire to a founder's name. So we have the personal name and the clan name. What then of the third part, Caesar? This we now call a family name, or cognomen, used to distinguish different branches within a large clan. The original meaning of the word Caesar is lost to time. Some speculate it meant thick head of hair, which, given Caesar's later anxieties on the subject, is rich with irony. Others suggest it meant bright-eyed, or that it commemorated an ancestor who had slain an elephant. In any event, these family names often derived from the nickname of a notable forebear. And this is true, only the great clans, populous and powerful, required such a distinction. the houses of Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar certainly did. Lesser families made do with just two names. The aforementioned Marius, for instance, was of plebeian stock. Wealthy, yes, but his name was a simple Gaius Marius. A personal name and a clan name, nothing more, but let us return to the main thread. After a year, Caesar's term as consul expired. He did not seek re-election. What grander ambition could he possibly have? To turn his back on so high an office. He was to become governor of Cisalpine Gaul. In fact, we have every reason to believe that his entire consular campaign was a means to this end. For Roman tradition dictated that after serving as consul, a man was entitled to a provincial governorship. Cisalpine Gaul, as it was known, referred to the lands south of the Alps. In what is now northern Italy, it was not a wealthy region. One might even call it a rustic nowhere. So why would Caesar, one of the three most powerful men in Rome, wish to be governor here, in this veritable backwater? The answer is simple. The man was clever, he possessed vision, and above all, he was ambitious. Caesar had long since perceived the new reality of Rome. Power no longer resided in the Senate, but with the man who held the loyalty of an army, and while Cisalpine Gaul was poor, it offered two distinct advantages. First, Roman law granted the governors of border provinces absolute military authority, including the command of legions. Second, the region was anything but peaceful. Its northern and western frontiers were wide open, vulnerable to the nomadic tribes who, as the saying goes, rode hard and drank heartily. At the moment Caesar took up his post, the Roman mind conceived of all peoples to the west and north as one undifferentiated mass of barbarians. Celts. It would not be until 7 years later, in the year 51 BC, that our man Caesar would solemnly jot down in his diary the name of the people to the north. The Germani. He likely learned the term from the Gauls, in whose language it simply meant neighbors. Only then did the Romans begin to understand that these tribes were not of the same stock as the Celts. They were, as it were, from a different village entirely. Regardless, Caesar was now governor of Cisalpine Gaul. His objectives were brutally clear. First, to forge an army loyal not to Rome, but to him. Second, to use that army to farm for battlefield renown against a series of conveniently weak barbarian tribes. As events would prove, he succeeded on both counts. In 58 BC, a Celtic tribe, the Helvetii, resolved to migrate south in search of more hospitable lands. Their intended path cut directly through Caesar's province, but this particular bald-headed wolf, as his detractors called him, delivered an unequivocal no. Why? Because the Helvetii served as a useful buffer between Rome and the northern tribes. If they were to vacate their lands, the Germani could be at the gates of Rome in a matter of days. In such a scenario, there would be no time for farming military glory. Caesar would spend his days frantically putting out fires, an exhausting and thankless task. And so, when his command that they return home went unheeded, Caesar attacked. The result was the utter rout of 380,000 Helvetii. Men, women, and children. Roughly 110,000 survivors were compelled, by Caesar's order, to return to their ancestral lands. The tragic irony was that, in a grand gesture of irreversible commitment, they had torched their own villages before setting out. Now they had to rebuild. As a historical footnote, these unfortunate Helvetii are now considered the primary ancestors of the modern Swiss. The official Latin name for Switzerland today remains the Helvetic Confederation. The victory over the Helvetii was a matter of considerable encouragement for Caesar. In 57 BC, he pushed beyond the Swiss territories, marching ever northward. There, he encountered the Belgae. They too were a branch of the Gallic people, but in Caesar's eyes, they were simply more barbarians in need of subjugation. After a great battle, the Belgae were thoroughly cowed, pledging their allegiance to this new Roman master. As their name might suggest, the Belgae are considered the progenitors of most of today's Belgians. The successive submission of the Helvetii and the Belgae sent a powerful message throughout Gaul. The tribes, great and small, felt the awesome might of Rome. The consequence was a rush to surrender. For those who refused, or for those who surrendered and then rebelled, Caesar was merciless. One tribe of mixed Gallic-Germanic heritage, the Achuatusai, rose in revolt. Caesar's response was simple and absolute: annihilation. Tens of thousands of civilians were sold into slavery, with every coin of the proceeds flowing directly into Caesar's personal coffers. The Achuatusai, as a people, vanished from the pages of history. It was, by any measure, a genocide. In this manner, over the years of his governorship, Caesar, by virtue of his unparalleled military genius, conquered the entirety of Gaul, a territory encompassing modern-day Switzerland, Belgium, France, and northern Italy. And on this vast domain, Caesar himself was the undisputed master. If we were to glance at a map of this new dominion, we would see the North Sea to the north, a desolate frontier of little interest. But to the northeast and the northwest, it was another matter entirely. The northeast, today the Netherlands and Germany, was then a wilderness. But unlike the empty sea, this wilderness was inhabited by the Germani. It was only now that Caesar learned that the people east of the Rhine were a different group from the Celts. After a few probing campaigns, he concluded that farming for glory against these particular tribes was a poor return on investment. It was not that he could not defeat them. It was that they were even more primitive than the Celts. They had no fixed settlements. You would attack, they would scatter. You would leave, they would return. After several such frustrating campaigns across the Rhine, Caesar gave it up as a bad job. If the northeast was a dead end, what of the northwest? Here too lay the sea. But the Romans had long known that this sea had another shore. One had only to cross a narrow strait, which we today call the English Channel, to reach it. And where there are people, there is the potential for slaves. If your fist is strong enough, wealth is sure to follow. Across that channel lay, of course, the isles we know as Britain. Today, those isles contain two nations. One, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, commonly known as the UK or Britain. The other, the Republic of Ireland. The name Britain itself derives from the Brythons, a Celtic people believed to be among the first to settle the islands. It is generally held that the Brythons, along with their Celtic cousins the Gaels and the Picts, were the original inhabitants. The Gaels were active in what is now Ireland and parts of Scotland. The Picts resided mostly in modern Scotland. The Brythons settled in what is now England. This was, and is, the area most vulnerable to invasion from the continent. Caesar, the later Anglo-Saxons, and others all made landfall in England before beginning their campaigns of conquest. One can only blame the Brythons' ancestors for their poor choice of real estate. Many, of course, would later flee to Scotland and Ireland, mixing with the Gaels and Picts to form the ancestral lines of the modern Irish, Welsh, Scottish, and Cornish peoples. These are entirely distinct from the English, a Germanic people who would not arrive for several centuries, but that is a story for another time. The Celts of Britain at this time followed an ancient religion, presided over by priests known as Druids, a name familiar to any modern enthusiast of fantasy games or fiction. It was a form of nature worship, revering the spirits of plants and the wild. In service to this faith, the Celts constructed countless sacred altars, open-air temples, and monumental tombs. The world-famous monument of Stonehenge is a relic of these people, though what it truly was, historians cannot say with certainty. An altar, some say. A great tomb, say others. We must simply wait for the white-bearded gentlemen to conclude their debate, a small point of modern etiquette. Should you ever have the chance to travel, it is best to avoid using the term the British Isles when in the Republic of Ireland. They are not fond of it. The name, they feel, carries an inherent bias towards Great Britain. Why should our island be defined by theirs? Because of this long-standing dispute. There is no universally accepted, politically neutral name for the archipelago. In official documents and polite conversation, one often hears the simple, diplomatic phrase, "these islands." So when Caesar arrived in Britannia, he found no tea-sipping ladies and gentlemen of the peerage. He found instead a wild land of tattooed Celtic warriors and an unsettling number of large, silent stones. These things, of course, did not intimidate the battle-hardened Caesar. In the years 54 and 53 BC, he crossed the Channel and won a series of victories. But ultimately, it was for naught. Why? Because Britain at that time was even less developed than the lands east of the Rhine, to use Caesar's own words. From a letter to his friend Cicero, the island was desperately poor, with not a scrap of gold or silver. As for slaves, they were as elusive as the Germani. They had no concept of a fixed home. You attacked, they fled. He could barely capture a single soul. At the same time, a major rebellion erupted back in Gaul. For these reasons, Caesar did not remain in Britain, nor did he make it a Roman province. He merely installed a pro-Roman chieftain and hurried back to the continent. Though he had failed to conquer the lands beyond the Rhine and the Channel, the vast territories he had brought under Roman dominion were more than enough to elevate him to the status of a war god in the eyes of the Roman people. He now had money, he had a private army, and he had a personal empire. This state of affairs was causing a certain unease among the old guard in the Roman Senate. Why? Because Caesar bore an unsettling resemblance to the Sulla of a generation past. The same ability, the same ambition, the same taste for autocratic power and disdain for the Senate. From the Senate's perspective, Caesar was perhaps even more dangerous than Sulla. For Sulla was of The Chinese letter, the aristocratic faction. Caesar was of The Chinese letter. The popular faction. Now, to say Caesar was of the popular faction is to speak of his political alignment, not his birth. He was, without question, born into the highest ranks of the nobility. But the political inheritance he had claimed was that of his uncle, Marius. And Marius was a new man, a wealthy commoner who had built his career by championing the cause of the people. By aligning himself with the supporters of Marius, Caesar became the leader of the popular faction, and now this champion of the people had acquired immense military glory. This set alarm bells ringing throughout the Senate, so they turned to Pompey, a man who could be counted among the aristocrats, hoping to enlist him in a coalition against Caesar. In truth, Pompey himself was already growing restless. There were three reasons for this. First, in 54 BC, his wife, Caesar's only daughter, died in childbirth. In that moment, Caesar was transformed from father-in-law back into a mere political acquaintance. The very foundation of their alliance had crumbled. Second, in 53 BC, Crassus, the third member of their triumvirate, was killed. His ambition to conquer the Parthian Empire had led him to a disastrous defeat in the east. Of the three heads, only two remained, and as we have often observed in history, a triangle is a stable structure. A standoff between two powers is anything but. With Crassus gone, Pompey saw his chance. The final reason for Pompey's change of heart was the sheer, breathtaking speed of Caesar's ascent. He felt that if he did not act now to check Caesar's power, the man would soon become too great to be challenged at all. For all these reasons, the Senate and Pompey found themselves in perfect accord. An agreement was reached. They would move against Caesar. In the year 49 BC, as Caesar was enjoying his proconsular authority in Gaul, a summons arrived from the Roman Senate. It commanded him to return to Rome immediately. The intent was transparent: to strip him of his military command, to render him a toothless tiger, and to force him into compliance. Of course, had Caesar obeyed, his fate would likely not have been so terrible. He would have returned a hero, perhaps served a few more terms as consul, and then retired to a comfortable and celebrated old age. This was the traditional path for victorious governors. There is a modern theory that he feared prosecution if he returned without his army. But a careful study of the historical record reveals no active charges against him at that time. It seems to be a rumor, nothing more. Nevertheless, Caesar chose to refuse. In his reply to the Senate, he wrote at great length about the lawlessness of Gaul, the constant threat of bandits, and the solemn duty he felt to remain at his post, to serve great Rome with every fiber of his being until his dying day. It was a very long letter. It could have been summarized in 2 words: I refuse. The Senate then issued its final ultimatum: return or be declared an enemy of the Roman people. In times past, such a declaration had been a powerful and effective tool. But this time, the Senate had miscalculated. From the moment he penned his reply, Caesar had already considered the worst-case scenario and made his choice. The ink on his letter was barely dry before he was on the march, leading his loyal legions toward the Italian heartland. The journey from Gaul to Italy required the crossing of a small river. Its name was the Rubicon. According to Suetonius, Caesar paused at the bank of this river, hesitating for a time. Then he turned to his men and uttered the first of his 3 immortal phrases. The die is cast. We must appreciate the gravity of this moment. In ancient Rome, a general could not simply march his army into the core territory of the state. It was forbidden, but the Roman rule was even stricter. Without the express permission of the Senate, no commander could lead an army into Italy proper. The Rubicon River was the legally defined northern boundary. To cross it with an army was an act of treason. Caesar had now resolved to make a final public break with the Senate. For him, the die was indeed cast. The outcome now depended on whether his soldiers would follow him down this revolutionary path of rebellion, or whether they would choose to uphold their loyalty to Rome and arrest him on the spot. What gave him the confidence to make such a gamble? The answer lay with the soldiers he had recruited in Gaul. For years, he had campaigned across that land, using his plunder to expand his army and his army to seize more land. The vast majority of his men were Gauls. They felt not a shred of sentimental attachment to the city of Rome. For them, crossing the Rubicon to attack Rome was a matter of complete indifference. With this bedrock of support, Caesar even addressed his veteran Roman soldiers. He told them that once they crossed the river, they were free to leave. He would not stop them. They could even continue to serve Rome and face him on the battlefield. And so, staking everything on a single throw, Caesar led his army into Italy and prepared to march on Rome. This was the year 49 BC. In Rome, a civil war, momentous and terrible, was about to begin. What was the outcome of this war, and in what direction would Rome now turn? When Caesar defied the Senate and crossed the Rubicon, the city of Rome descended into chaos. The first thought of both the Senate and Pompey was the same: run. Why? Because Roman law forbade the stationing of armies in Italy. They were defenseless. They had nothing with which to resist. It was not only the politicians. Many of the city's nobles, recalling the bloody purges of Sulla, packed their belongings, gathered their families, and fled. Among them was a man we must now introduce: Marcus Tullius Cicero. From his 3-part name, you can surmise he was of a prominent family. Yet Cicero was a noble of a different sort. He belonged to the equestrian class. Strictly speaking, ancient Rome had 2 tiers of aristocracy. The senatorial class were the old money traditionalists, noble since time immemorial. The second tier was the equestrian class. These were, to put it simply, the nouveau rich, men whose families had amassed great fortunes during Rome's foreign conquests, during the reforms of the Gracchi brothers. These wealthy men were formally recognized as nobles, eligible to hold public office and with good performance even ascend to the Senate. Cicero was one such man. So when he finally, after a long career in lesser offices, was elected consul in 63 BC, he was referred to by the Senate as a novus homo, a new man, a political term for the first member of a family ever to reach such a high office. During his consulship, Cicero successfully thwarted a coup aimed at overthrowing the Republic. This had two lasting effects on the man. First, it became the unceasing subject of his own self-praise. The historian Plutarch, in his biography of Cicero, felt compelled to note that while Cicero was a brilliant orator, his speeches after this event became tedious and insufferably long, as he would invariably spend a great deal of time boasting of this one accomplishment, recounting a story his audience could already recite from memory. The second consequence was that Cicero became a fanatical defender of the republican system. He seemed to believe he had been put on earth by the gods for this very purpose. How else could a man who had never led an army in his life defeat a rebellion? He thus developed a philosophy of concord of the orders, a belief that all classes of Rome should coexist peacefully under the umbrella of the Republic. Holding fast to these ideals, when Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus formed their triumvirate in 60 BC, Cicero coldly refused their invitation to join. But when one snubs the three most powerful men in the city, one's influence tends to wane. From that point on, Cicero's political voice was much diminished. Disheartened, he began to write. The bulk of his great literary and philosophical works were produced in the years between this political marginalization and his death. Cicero could never have known it, but the political legacy he so desperately craved would amount to very little. It was his writing, a secondary pursuit born of frustration, that would make him one of the most influential figures in all of history. For during the Renaissance in the 14th century, his letters were rediscovered. Their contents were a revelation to the scholars of Europe, who devoured and disseminated his ideas. Some have even said that the European Renaissance was, in essence, a rebirth of the thought of this man, Cicero. So what did he write? His output was immense. He wrote, for instance, a beautiful essay on the virtues of old age. A piece of rhetoric so persuasive it could make one eager for the simple pleasures of later life. But what truly captivated the minds of the Renaissance, and later the American founding fathers, were his works on the Republic and on the laws. In simple terms, Cicero analyzed the three primary forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. He argued that each in its pure form was flawed. The worst of all, he concluded, was pure democracy, for it could easily devolve into the tyranny of an irrational mob. His solution was a mixed constitution, one that blended elements of all three, giving each class a share of power. And the glue holding this system together was not popular will, but law based upon reason. Within this legal framework, all men could debate the affairs of state as equals. These ideas are now seen as an ancient precursor to the doctrine of the separation of powers. His thought was inherited and developed by Locke, Hume, Montesquieu, and America's own Thomas Paine, a lineage that extends to the present day, which is why, when one mentions the name Cicero in certain circles of the Western elite, they are apt to stand in tribute. But commanding the respect of modern elites is not the same as enjoying it in one's own time. Back in 49 BC, before the might of Caesar, even the great Cicero was forced to bend. Objectively, there was a certain mutual admiration between the two men, a respect of one great mind for another. The basis of this was not politics or war, but literature. Both men were masters of the Latin language. Caesar's legacy includes titles like statesman, general, and dictator, but one must also add man of letters. His commentaries on the Gallic War, written during his campaigns, is a paragon of Latin prose, a work praised even by a linguistic artist like Cicero. It was in that very work, incidentally, that Caesar first used the word Germani to refer to the tribes east of the Rhine, cementing the term in the Roman lexicon. Because of this shared literary sensibility, Cicero held a certain fondness for Caesar, and Caesar, in turn, appreciated Cicero. He once paid Cicero a compliment of the highest order. "Your accomplishment is greater than that of the great generals. To have expanded the frontiers of the human mind is a more valuable achievement than to have expanded the borders of the Roman Empire." Such praise was, of course, intoxicating to a man as fond of self-aggrandizement as Cicero. It was because of this atmosphere of mutual, if ambiguous, appreciation that when Caesar crossed the Rubicon and took Rome, Cicero, though he fled the city, did not follow Pompey to Greece. He retreated to his family estate in southern Italy. Remaining within Caesar's sphere of influence, he believed that, given their special relationship, they could surely come to some understanding. They could not. Having crossed the Rubicon, Caesar was unalterably set on a course to reorganize the state according to his own will. It was a path to dictatorship. This was diametrically opposed to the republican ideals Cicero held so dear. Eventually, Cicero realized that no compromise was possible, nor could he remain neutral, for that would only earn him the enmity of both sides. And so, compelled by his ideals, Cicero finally chose Pompey. On the 7th of June, 49 BC, the great orator fled Italy and joined Pompey's camp in Greece, though to say he fled is perhaps an overstatement. Caesar, it seems, paid him no mind at all. So, did Pompey have the strength to challenge Caesar? One must be careful with that question. At that moment in time, the question should have been reversed. Did Caesar have the strength to challenge Pompey? For Pompey's power on paper was far greater. This advantage was twofold. First, he held the legal high ground. The full name of the Roman state was Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome. The Senate had declared Caesar a public enemy. Legally, he was a traitor. This fact alone caused many of Caesar's own Roman veterans to desert and join Pompey. The second advantage was military and economic. Caesar held Gaul and Italy, but Pompey controlled Spain, Greece, Egypt, and the vast allied kingdoms of the East. In both manpower and wealth, he was superior. Caesar understood this perfectly. To avoid being caught in a pincer movement, he acted with breathtaking speed, while Pompey was mustering his forces in Greece. Caesar launched a surprise invasion of Spain. In a lightning campaign of just 27 days, he crushed Pompey's forces there, securing his rear. He then returned to Rome, where he was, with no hint of suspense, elected consul. His business in Rome concluded, Caesar and his deputy, Mark Antony, wasted not a day. He led 7 legions across the sea to Greece. Preparing to force a decisive battle with Pompey, theoretically, Pompey had 3 options. He could ally with the Parthian Empire to the east. He could use his naval superiority to invade Italy. Or he could face Caesar in a decisive battle in Greece. In reality, the first option was unthinkable. Allying with a traditional enemy would have been political suicide. The second was impractical. Even if he retook Italy, he would still face Caesar's superior infantry on land. That left only one choice: a decisive battle in Greece. In July of 48 BC, the 2 armies met at the Battle of Pharsalus. Caesar commanded some 20,000 men. Pompey had at least twice that number, a clear numerical advantage. Unfortunately for Pompey, he wagered everything on a flawed strategy. He believed his superior cavalry could outflank Caesar's legions and attack them from behind. Unfortunately, because Caesar had anticipated his anticipation, he knew this was precisely what Pompey would do. More importantly, he had a counter. Hidden from Pompey's view was an elite reserve of his most disciplined infantry. From this group, he selected 3,000 of his very best to form a special 4th line, a veritable suicide squad. Their mission: to meet Pompey's cavalry head-on. In ancient warfare, this was suicidal. Infantry could not withstand a direct cavalry charge, but Caesar gave his men a specific, unorthodox command. They were not to throw their javelins. They were to hold their ground, form a wall of shields, and use their spears as pikes, aiming for the unprotected faces and eyes of the charging horsemen. Our success, he told them, depends on you. His faith was not misplaced. The 3,000 infantrymen formed an iron wall, withstood the thunderous charge of thousands of cavalry, and held them in place. They bought just enough time for Caesar's main force to win the battle on the primary front. Then, caught in a pincer, Pompey's vaunted cavalry broke and fled. Pompey himself, seeing the tide turn, fled the field, made for the coast, and escaped by sea. According to Plutarch, Caesar lost 1,200 men in the battle. In Caesar's own account, his losses were just over 200. Whether 200 or 1,200, the result was the same, a total and decisive victory. The whole of Greece now belonged to Caesar, and where did Pompey flee to? Egypt. The Ptolemaic dynasty, founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, was a Roman client state, but it was not a Roman province. It maintained a semi-independent status. Pompey hoped to find refuge there. At this time, Egypt was ruled jointly by the young King Ptolemy Roman XIII and his older half-sister, who was also his wife, Cleopatra Roman VII. This practice of sibling marriage to preserve the purity of the royal bloodline was not merely a custom in Ptolemaic Egypt, it was the law. The problem now was Pompey, rowing towards their shore in a small boat, crying for help. What were they to do? The king and his court, in the sisters' absence, reached a decision with almost no hesitation: cold reception. They could not possibly grant him refuge. It was the same logic that prevents a small nation from granting asylum to a high-profile defector from a superpower. To shelter Pompey was to invite the wrath of Caesar, and they knew they could not defeat Caesar. The logical course of action would have been to politely turn him away. But one of the king's chief ministers, a eunuch named Pothinus, had a better idea, a crueler idea. They would welcome Pompey ashore. Then they would cut off his head and present it to Caesar as a gift. His plan was a success. Pompey the Great, one of Rome's most celebrated generals, was murdered by Egyptian courtiers. He was 58 years old. One might assume Pothinus did this solely to curry favor with Caesar. But that was only part of his calculation. He had a deeper motive. He hoped to use Caesar to eliminate Cleopatra. Pothinus was loyal to the young king Ptolemy, and he had grown alarmed by Cleopatra's ambition and influence. He and other ministers had recently conspired to exile her to Syria, but Cleopatra was not one to accept defeat. She was, at that very moment, raising an army to reclaim her throne. Pothinus's scheme was to kill Pompey, please Caesar, and then convince Caesar to deal with the troublesome queen. He failed to account for two things. First, he failed to anticipate Caesar's reaction. Upon being presented with Pompey's severed head, Caesar displayed not gratitude, but fury. We cannot know the true reason. Perhaps he had wanted the satisfaction of killing Pompey himself, or perhaps, in spite of everything, a genuine bond remained between the two men. Pompey was, after all, his former son-in-law. It was a family matter, and what right did these Egyptians have to interfere? In any case, the attempt to curry favor had backfired spectacularly. Pothinus's second failure was in underestimating Cleopatra. She had precisely the same idea as he did, to use Caesar to eliminate her domestic rivals. And her method was rather more effective. She had herself smuggled back into the palace, wrapped, so the story goes, in a priceless carpet, which was then delivered as a gift to Caesar. According to the legend, that night, Caesar, preparing for bed, unrolled the carpet. Inside, he found not fine textiles, but a naked and very beautiful young woman of 20. The two of them, in their shared state of undress, are said to have held a long and productive dialogue on matters of state, exchanging views on the great issues of the day. The Roman consul found the Egyptian queen to be exceptionally intelligent and gifted. For the mutual benefit of the Roman and Egyptian peoples, he decided to help this woman secure the pinnacle of power in her country. What else they discussed, or what else they did, Caesar did not record. We only know that sometime later, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Caesarion. Or, to be less subtle, Little Caesar. When news of Cleopatra's dramatic reappearance spread, Pothinus knew he had to act. He dispatched assassins to eliminate the pair of them. Did the assassins succeed? And what impact would this attempt have on Caesar and on the fate of Egypt? the assassins failed. Their failure led Pothinus to drop all pretense and besiege Caesar's position with Egyptian troops. But Caesar's personal guard were veterans of the Gallic Wars. They were made of harder stuff. They held out until Roman reinforcements arrived, then launched a counterattack. Captured Pothinus and promptly separated his head from his shoulders. During this fighting, a fire broke out which tragically spread to the great library of Alexandria, destroying a vast portion of its irreplaceable collection. A loss not just for Egypt, but for all humanity. With Pothinus dead, the conflict was over. King Ptolemy Roman 13 was summarily drowned in the Nile, and Cleopatra Roman 7 became the undisputed queen of Egypt. To observe the old laws, however, she married another of her younger brothers, Ptolemy Roman 14, and they were declared co-rulers, but everyone in Egypt and in Rome knew the name of the queen's true consort, Julius Caesar, while Caesar was enjoying his extended diplomatic mission in Egypt. Trouble stirred in the east. The kingdom of Pontus was in revolt. In history, there are certain nations that seem to exist only to provide aspiring heroes with opportunities for glory. Years before, a revolt in Pontus had propelled Sulla to power. Now it was Caesar's turn, and this time, Pontus not only provided a victory, but also the occasion for the second of Caesar's 3 immortal phrases. Veni vidi vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. He sent this message as his victory report to the Roman Senate, just those 3 Latin words. The message was as concise as it was arrogant. Its subtext was clear: I am Caesar, I am this swift, this powerful, this decisive. What hope have you of opposing me? This phrase, of course, has been widely quoted and adapted. In 2011, the American Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, remarked on the death of Muammar Gaddafi by saying, "We came, we saw, he died." A rather more prosaic, if grimly effective, adaptation. We must remember that Rome at this time was still technically in a state of civil war. Though Pompey was dead, the forces of the Senate and the aristocracy had not truly capitulated. Caesar had not yet returned to the city since leaving to pursue Pompey. The threat in his message, therefore, was unmistakable. In 46 BC, having swept through Pompey's allies, Egypt and Pontus, Caesar returned to Rome. The Senate and the aristocrats in one voice declared their submission. "You are our master." As proof, they granted him a triumph, a victory celebration that lasted an unprecedented 10 days. He then began a radical overhaul of the Roman state. There were 2 key reforms. First, he expanded the Senate from 300 members to 900. You might ask, did this not strengthen his opposition? Of course not, for the new members were all to be appointed by Caesar himself. His cronies, his supporters, even some former slaves were elevated to the Senate, unthinkable in years past. He likewise increased the number of senior magistrates, creating more positions to fill with his own men, all without removing any of the existing office holders. A masterful stroke of political engineering. His second major reform was of the provinces. He standardized taxes, and most importantly, he extended Roman citizenship to many people in the allied states. This vastly increased his base of popular support. He also established numerous colonies throughout the provinces to settle his veterans and the urban poor. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of people benefited directly from his policies. Among these great reforms was one smaller but profoundly influential change. The Julian calendar. Working with a Greek astronomer, Caesar created a new calendar to replace the old, inaccurate Roman one. He increased the number of months from 10 to 12, established the system of alternating month lengths, and introduced the concept of a leap year every 4 years. The year now averaged 365.25 days, and it began on the 1st of January. If this sounds familiar, it is because it is the direct ancestor of the modern Western calendar. Our current Gregorian calendar is merely a slight refinement, correcting the average year length to a more accurate 365.2425 days. The Julian calendar was so successful that it remained in use in Europe for 1600 years. The British Empire and its American colonies did not abandon it until 1752. The names of our months are also a legacy of Caesar. January through June are named for Roman gods and festivals. But July through December were originally just the Latin numbers for 5 through 10. September, for example, the 9th month, is named from the Latin for 7. This is because Caesar added his 2 new months, January and February, to the beginning of the year, shifting everything else back. After Caesar's death, the month of Quintilis was renamed July in his honor. Later, Sextilis was renamed August for his successor, Augustus, and so the names have remained. These reforms were only possible because Caesar held absolute power. His dictatorship went even further than Sulla's. Sulla had used his power to restore the authority of the Senate. Caesar used his power to make the Senate an instrument of his own will. By the year 44 BC, he had reached the apex of his political life. He was appointed Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. He held the titles of Imperator, Pontifex Maximus, and Pater Patrii, Father of the Fatherland. He held all military, executive, judicial, and religious authority in his hands. He was, in name and in fact, the absolute ruler of Rome. The title Father of the Fatherland was not his invention. The first to receive it was Camillus, the man who had saved Rome from the Gauls centuries before. Cicero had also been granted the title. Now, it belonged to Caesar. And it was fitting. When one man makes all the decisions, is he not, in a sense, the father of the nation? Caesar's problem was that he began to act as if he were a literal father. Specifically, to a young man named Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus's mother, Servilia, had been Caesar's longtime mistress. Their affair began when Brutus was a boy and lasted for over 30 years. It was, by all accounts, the great love of Caesar's life. Because of Servilia, Caesar treated Brutus as his own son. He protected him, nurtured his career, and forgave his transgressions. But Brutus did not return the affection. He hated Caesar. Though it was Pompey who had killed his biological father, Brutus sided with Pompey against Caesar in the civil war. After Pompey's defeat, Caesar not only pardoned Brutus, but at Servilia's request, gave him a high position in the government. Still, Brutus hated him. Where does such hatred come from, for a man who gave your mother happiness and gave you your life and career? Historians say Brutus was a fervent Republican who despised Caesar's tyranny. A student of psychology, however, might suggest a different motive, perhaps a touch of the Oedipal, a deep-seated jealousy of the man his mother had loved for decades. But that is merely one man's speculation. Of course, Brutus was not alone in his hatred. There were staunch Republicans, and there were senators who simply resented Caesar's immense personal power. In 44 BC, 2 events galvanized these disparate groups into a conspiracy. First, Caesar's deputy, Mark Antony, publicly offered him a crown. Caesar refused it. But to many, this was merely a performance, a test to gauge public opinion. Second, Caesar began planning a massive campaign against the Parthian Empire. Just before his planned departure, a prophecy began to circulate. Parthia could only be conquered by a king. For the conspirators, the implication was terrifyingly clear. Caesar intended to use a victory in the east as a pretext to declare himself king. These 2 events created an unmistakable signal in the minds of Brutus and his allies. Caesar intended to be king. They had to act. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, Caesar was lured to a meeting of the Senate. As he was reading from a petition, one of the conspirators, Cassius, struck the first blow, stabbing him in the neck with a dagger concealed in his sleeve. Immediately, other senators swarmed him. Daggers flashing, Caesar fought back until he saw a face in the crowd, the face of Brutus, contorted with rage, rushing towards him. At that moment, Caesar gave up the struggle. He pulled his toga over his head to cover his face and submitted to his fate. he fell at the foot of a statue of his great rival. Pompey, pierced by 23 wounds, the reign of Caesar was over. Some accounts say that in that final moment he spoke. The most famous version of his last words comes to us from Shakespeare. "Et tu, Brute, then fall Caesar." Other sources suggest a phrase whose meaning, though debated, conveys a profound sense of paternal heartbreak. "You too, my child." It captures the utter shock of a man seeing the child he had raised, the boy he had protected, coming at him with a blade full of hate. In that instant, even a man as great as Caesar must have felt his heart turn to ash and found this world no longer worth the trouble. In Shakespeare's play, Brutus stands over the body and declares, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. In reality, it is unlikely he said any such thing, or if he did, no one was listening, because the moment Caesar fell, the assassins simply stood there, dumbfounded. The prevailing sentiment seems to have been a collective, unspoken question: "Gods above, what have we just done?" Then, one by one, they turned and fled the Senate House. The sheer amateurism of the act suggests it was not a long-planned conspiracy, but a flash of spontaneous violence. A desperate pact made just moments before the meeting. A long and careful plot would surely have been detected by Caesar's spies. It was its very hastiness, its chaotic improvisation, that allowed it to succeed. A strange twist of fate. The death of Caesar has been debated for centuries. Some see it as a victory for the Republic, a just end for a tyrant. The state seal of Virginia in the United States still bears Brutus's supposed cry in the original Latin, though, tellingly, the meaning of the phrase has become so obscure to most Americans that it is often mistaken for a different slogan entirely, a fact that would surely disappoint the American founding fathers, who were steeped in Roman history and even used Brutus as a pen name. Others believe Caesar's death was a catastrophe for Rome. A few see Brutus as nothing more than an ungrateful traitor. But on one point, there is no debate. Caesar's military and political genius was unparalleled. The imperial titles of later German and Russian emperors, Kaiser and Tsar, are both direct linguistic descendants of his name. Many historians mark this year, 44 BC, the year Caesar was made dictator for life and then murdered, as the end of the Roman Republic. Its institutions were, from this point forward, a hollow shell. But if the Republic was dead, did the empire begin? Not yet. There was an intervening period of 17 years, a power vacuum. Why? Because the assassins, having killed Caesar, had no plan for what to do next. Their paralysis allowed Caesar's key allies, his deputy, Mark Antony, and his lover, Queen Cleopatra, who was in Rome at the time, to escape the city. Someone urged Brutus to convene the Senate immediately and elect new consuls. A logical, necessary, and politically astute suggestion. Brutus's reply was a moment of such staggering political ineptitude that it beggars belief. He said that since the other consul, Antony, was absent, it would be illegal to hold a meeting. Consider the logic. You have just stabbed one of the two consuls to death. The other has fled the city in terror of you. And now you suddenly develop a punctilious regard for legal procedure. It reveals one simple truth. Brutus had no political talent whatsoever. He had no idea what to do. All of Caesar's tutelage had been for naught. And because Brutus did not know what to do, someone else did. And who was that person?